Mr. Kinda, Nepal has been undergoing a period of sluggish economic growth for past few years, and medium-term projections from the IMF are not encouraging either. What would you analyze the current economic situation in Nepal?
Thank you. This is a very important question for us and a question on which we have paid some attention during our visit. What we see is that indeed Nepal has come from a relatively, what I would say, slow growth. Last year, our estimation was that growth is around 1% of GDP. This is for last year. But this year, what we expect to see is some recovery in growth. Mm-hmm. Our current projection is that growth will be at about 3%, 1%. Mm-hmm. So, and we believe that this will be on the basis of relatively strong capital expenditure. We hope to see that materializing in the second half of the year. And we also hope that credit growth, which has been quite subdued in the first half of the year, will improve. So in terms of the medium term, even though we see a recovery from 0.8 to about 3%, our medium-term prospect is positive. And we expect to see Nepal growth going back to about 5% in the medium term. Yeah. And what we expect is to see strategic investment, particularly in the energy sector, to help boost growth back to around 5% in the coming years.
Nepal is currently grappling with the significant economic challenges. Domestic demand is remarkably low. Government revenue collection is not robust as hoped, and expenditure remain below average due to funding shortages. Country appears to be slipping into a cycle of low revenue, low expenditure, and low demand, potentially leading to an economic recession. What are your thoughts on the situation?
Thank you. No, this is clearly a quite challenging situation in the sense that we do see indeed low revenue. But I should say that when we look at the execution of the budget in the first half of the year, we see some growth in revenue. So it may be as much as we want, but there is hope because revenue is growing back. In terms of spending, I agree that we see that spending execution is below what we expected, particularly in capital spending, which is really important to boost growth. And as you say, capital spending has been low because of funding issues. We see that there is a way to, at the same time, boost capital spending while facing and addressing the low revenue. And that way is relying more on donor financing, which is concessional, which can help provide financing for capital spending without or before revenue growth picks up. So we do see some hope, and we believe that even though the situation now can be challenging, in the near future, Nepal will be able to have both higher capital spending and also higher revenue. And this is why we're working with the government in terms of implementing a domestic revenue mobilization strategy that will help boost revenue, and also a public investment management action that will help increase capital spending. And we hope that in the near future, results could start to be visible in those two aspects.
Supplementing to this question, what recommendations would you propose for the economic recovery, particularly in stimulating aggregate domestic demand?
Yeah, this is an important question for us, and we've been advising the government in that. We believe that in the current situation, one area where that will quickly provide boost to domestic demand is capital spending. And clearly, we don't want at the same time capital spending to go to waste. It's very, very important to do it wisely, slowly, and to really target the most efficient project. And discussing with the government, that's something that comes out from the Ministry of Finance, essentially that the objective, of course, is to increase capital spending, but to do it in a very proper way, meaning that to really target the best profitable project and invest in this project. So there is hope. So we believe that going forward, capital spending increase could really provide a boost to domestic demand.
Yeah. Nepal's bank and financial institutions are grappling with the challenge of low capital adequacy ratios, hindering their capacity for additional lending. Moreover, starting from this year, banks are obligated to uphold an additional 0.5% of core capital as a counter-cyclical buffer. What potential solutions do you propose for addressing this issue?
So what we say is that system-wide Nepal banking sector is sound, meaning when you take the banking system as a whole, of course you can have few banks where there is need for capitalization and capital adequacy ratio are on the low side. So the solution in order to boost growth is not really to relax regulation, is to focus on why credit is not growing. And when we look at the system as wide, clearly liquidity is ample. So credit is low not because there is no liquidity. Liquidity is ample. Credit is low because also demand, there is a demand issue. So this is why we think that boosting demand will really help ignite the credit growth further. Let me ask that, but saying that having credit growth of high credit growth is not necessarily a good situation. What is the best situation is to have a credit growth that is healthy and that leads to economic growth. So if we look at in the past in Nepal, clearly some credit growth did not really lead to economic growth. What is important from now on is to have a lower credit growth, but a credit growth that is associated with stronger economic growth. And we believe that having the reform now in terms of a working capital loan, amended asset classification regulation will help Nepal have a healthier and more sustainable credit growth that support economic activity.
So as you mentioned, the Nepal Rashtra Bank issued working capital loan guidelines last year as part of its commitment under the extended credit facility. However, the private sector expressed dissatisfaction with the guidelines and exerted pressure on the central bank to make amendments. In response to their demands, Nepal Rashtra Bank has revised the guidelines multiple times. How do you analyze these developments in Nepal?
Clearly, we've been supporting the Nepal Rashtra Bank, NRB, in terms of implementing these amended asset classification regulation and working capital loan guidelines, which we see as very, very important. There is a background to this, right? Credit is very low, even though the measures are very important, and we believe that continuous implementation is very, very critical. It's also important to take into account the underlying economic situation. So the fact that the NRB has to amend a couple of times the regulation does not mean that the regulation do not do a proper job. It only means that sometimes it takes time, or having a smooth and gradual process may be better for the underlying economic situation. And what we see is that the amended asset classification regulation are already bearing fruit, because when we look at the composition of credit to the economy in Nepal, we do see that term loans that are more appropriate for investment are increasing, while working capital loans that are less appropriate for investment are decreasing. So this is a healthy transition that we see and that we want to encourage. Now going forward, it's important for the NRB to keep implementing these regulations and to keep enhancing them and tightening them as the situation improves.
So some individuals in Nepal, particularly in the private sector, perceive that the IMF is intervening the country's domestic economic policies, particularly in the monetary policy. Could you please clarify how the IMF recommends policy reforms to the countries? Has it genuinely interfered in Nepal's domestic policy? Kindly elaborate, considering Nepal's major commitments under the extended credit facility.
The IMF program, as it is in all countries, is essentially we are here to support the government. So the government has its own economic reform program. As you can see, in the context of the investment summit, you can see that the government has many reforms that are being implemented, right? So the economic reform plan that the government has with the IMF is in the same spirit. Essentially, what we do as first step, we listen to the government. We come, we listen to the government. Government tell us what the priorities are to improve the economic and to implement reform in Nepal. And with that, because we also work in many other countries, we try to bring in what we have as experience in other countries, what work in other countries. And together with the government, we come to a number of reforms that both sides believe are important, and then we support the government in implementing those reforms. So we do not, this is not essentially the IMF program, it is the government program, but the IMF support it. But of course, as you all know, implementing such reform are difficult. And we fully understand that, and this is the case in many countries. This is why we always there to support the government. We provide technical assistance to help in terms of the implementation of the program. But the program provides, in a way, a commitment device. It helps bring all parties together. It helps bring the macro situation together. It helps shows why implementing this reform is important for this other reform, and how it can hold together help the country be better off tomorrow. So it's in that context that we help the government, but we do not impose anything on the government. We work together with the government and we listen to the government.
So you do not interference in the domestic policies?
We do not interfere in the domestic policy. What we do is to help the government in implementing its economic priorities. What we do is to bring in expertise, because we have experts going in all countries to help the government implement its policies. What we do is really to look at what works in the world, but we don't just take it and bring it to Nepal. We look at also the specificities. Nepal is unique. We look at the uniqueness of Nepal, and then we work together with the government to adapt the policies to the case of Nepal.
Nepal's commitment under the ECF, such as amending laws to grant autonomy to the Nepal Rashtra Bank, conducting external audits of 10 major commercial banks, reviewing asset quality, and ensuring transparency by making government-granted tax exemptions accessible to public, remain unfulfilled, I think. How do you analyze Nepal's progress in economic reform?
I will say that actually this reform, I will not say that they are unfulfilled. I will say that they're in progress. For instance, the amendment of the NRB Act, this is a long process. It requires discussions with authorities. We can bring in what other countries are doing, but it's very, very important for us to listen to authorities, listen to why they think some aspect of what we are proposing may not be very suitable to Nepal. So we listen, and then we continue discussing, and then we reach an agreement of both what is, based on our experience, is important, but also based on the government views, can fit Nepal. So we work together to achieve that. It is in that context that, for instance, for the NRB Act, we thought that we decided together with the government to give more time to have more discussions. For the loan portfolio review, the launch has not yet started. We are not in preparation, and the preparation is progressing well. The launch is supposed to take place in a few months from now, and we hope that that will be feasible. So in a nutshell, we do see progress in the reform areas that we agreed on with the government. As I said before, our role is to agree with the government what is important, and then provide policy advice and support to the government, but always be listening to the government and working together.
So don't you think that it could have more expedited?
Yeah, of course. Reform can always be implemented faster. But what is really important is ownership. So we want the government, because the government also has to explain to the people why we are doing this reform. Sometimes if the people or the business community don't fully understand, it's important for the government to take the time to explain so that there is consensus, because we believe that if a reform is on, if the government believes this is our reform and the IMF is only supporting us, this reform will be longer lasting. It will stay longer even after the end of the program. So that's what we want. We don't want a reform just because there is a IMF program and after that the reform is no longer there. So we work really hand in hand with the government, and we believe that that's the way to go.
So Nepal currently possesses a strong foreign currency reserve, adequate to sustain imports of goods and services over a year. Generally, there is a consensus that countries should maintain reserves equivalent to 100% of short-term debt, or approximately 3 to 4 months of imports. Is such a substantial reserve necessary for Nepal? And how can these reserves be optimally utilized within the country?
I think this is a very important question. I think it comes in the context that Nepal has a fixed exchange rate. So it's very, very important to keep ample reserve. And I think what is also important is that we remember that about 2 years ago, the situation was not the same, which means that situation can sometimes change very quickly. And having the high level of reserve, as you mentioned, that Nepal has, is definitely a strength, is a very, very good economic strength of that Nepal has. It shows that Nepal also has good fundamentals. So not only that, you have very strong level and high level of reserve, you also have relatively low level of debt. So from a fiscal perspective, from an external perspective, it really shows that Nepal has relatively good economic fundamentals. So that, in a way, paves the way. It shows to the world that Nepal is in a relatively strong position. So even if you come invest, there is low risk that you have an exchange rate adjustment when you are investing. So I believe that it's very important to protect this reserve and to use them only when necessary. Maybe one last point is that, of course, the reserves are growing. One, because of strong remittances. Two, because of strong tourism. But also, let's not forget, because of subdued import growth. So when imports recover, that will mean that the reserve accumulation will be less, or even the reserve will decline. But that will not be a problem because the starting level is very high. So it's very important to keep that in mind, that at times having high reserve is very, very important to face future shocks.
How can these reserves be utilized optimally within the country?
The best way to use the reserve are supposed to be buffers. Right? They are buffers. And in terms of buffer, the way buffers are is that you keep them in a very, safe until the situation emerges and the need for their use emerges. Let me give you one example. In terms of consistency of policy that we're advising. Clearly, aggregate demand is low. We all agree on that. Second, we agree that accelerating capital spending is important. We also agree that this is an area where the government, in particular the Ministry of Finance, is making effort to accelerate capital spending. And what we hope is that that effort will start bearing fruit. And even in our projection, we expect to see some increase in capital spending already in the second half of the year. When we see capital spending increasing, it will mean higher imports, even this year. And this higher import will need to be financed by the reserve that are there. So, and they will be used in that way, and we believe that's, for instance, one optimal way of using it. But it needs to be properly generated. So you have good selection of investment project, like the government is thinking of now. You select the project, you implement them, it means higher import, then you use your reserve for that. And that leads to higher growth, and then it's a good cycle. So that's the way we see it, and we hope to see it materializing soon.
The IMF has indicated that the transmission of monetary policy in Nepal is weak, especially in the context of balance sheet repair and inflation control. I believe that controlling inflation through monetary policy is challenging for Nepal, given the pegging of Nepalese rupees with the Indian rupees. So what recommendations would propose to enhance the effectiveness of Nepal's monetary policy?
In terms of monetary policy for Nepal, this is not the case only of Nepal. Usually monetary policy transmission in all developing countries, emerging and low-income countries, can be impaired. And there is always room to improve that transmission of monetary policy. Now, a key question that we've been asking ourselves is clearly the transmission, for instance, from monetary policy to credit growth. Right? Credit growth has been quite subdued, and we understand the frustration that could arise from that. But one thing to emphasize is that liquidity, for instance, in the system is quite ample. and by having way to mob liquidity that could already help. The second aspect of it is monetary policy, for instance, was relaxed in the last, I would say, few months. And when you start looking, it takes time, first of all, to have a transmission from that to deposit rate. And when you look at the dynamic, you can see it already impacting deposit rate. But of course, the transmission takes time. It can be accelerated, but over time, we will see that transmission playing out. And normally, that should lead to essentially less incentive to save and more incentive to invest. Not only that, if deposit rate also decline, it will lead to lower lending rate, and again, that could lead to more incentive to borrow. So it will take time. I mean, it's a relatively long process, but we believe that with the action that the NRB is taking, that will lead to, some slow but steady improvement in monetary policy transmission.
The fiscal deficit of the country is excessively high compared to capital expenditure over the last decade. It implies that government is utilizing borrowed funds for recurrent expenditures, including public servants' salaries, or for debt repayment. How do you analyze the allocative efficiency of the government? So do you believe this practice is sustainable?
I think overall, in terms of assessment of public debt, our assessment of Nepal public debt is that it is sustainable. It is what we call at low risk of debt distress. It means that we don't see any issue in terms of the sustainability of public debt. And if Nepal has, if we have to summarize only two strengths, I think, as I said, one will be the external sector, high level of reserve, very good. And the second one will be on fiscal sustainability, which means low level of debt. Of course, the level of debt has increased. Even though it's low, it increased recently.
Exactly.
And that calls for prudence, right? So in order to maintain the level of debt now, which is fine, but in order to avoid it increasing further, we see two things. One is how to increase revenue and how to make sure that the revenue is protected and we don't see the drop that we saw. So domestic revenue mobilization in that context is very important, and in the discussion that we have with the government, we are looking at that, and the government also has a high commission that was put in place by the Ministry of Finance to start looking at that, and we believe that this is a very, very important aspect where the government should focus to increase revenues. That's one. Second aspect is clearly in terms of spending. In terms of spending, we have to be a bit careful, right? Because what we see even in the execution of a budget this year is low spending. Low spending can be good because it means less debt, but it's not necessarily good when, for instance, you don't spend in capital. So it's important to raise revenue and increase the capital spending, which will lead to growth and even higher revenue. But overall, the debt situation, what we see is a sustainable level of debt, which is fine.
What do you say that on utilizing the borrowed money in the recurrent expenditure or repayment of the debt?
In terms of borrowed money, almost all countries many countries, I should say, rely on domestically borrowed fund for spending or externally financed. In the case of Nepal, for instance, Nepal has access to quite large concessional financing, which could be a nice way, a good way to finance development spending, particularly infrastructure spending, without having to borrow at a relatively high level. So this is definitely one area for success. Now, in terms of using debt to finance recurrent spending, some countries try to avoid that and use debt only for capital spending. But again, these are countries usually that are in relatively weak position in terms of fiscal. When the debt level is high, then it's very important to avoid it. In the case of Nepal, the overall debt level is not that high. I think keeping the debt at that level, around 50% of GDP, is okay. But making sure that there is more spending that goes to capital spending is important. Because if that happens, it will mean higher growth, higher revenue, and then essentially you can have high growth while keeping the level of debt as the same. But if you spend more in current spending, it will mean low growth, and then it means you have to keep borrowing more and more and more, and then that will lead to higher growth of your debt, which is problematic. So I will say that in a nutshell is where the money goes that is important. And the government is trying to, for instance, rationalize spending duplication between the central and the local government, which is an area that is very, very important. And one advice that we have is to pay particular attention to that, because sometimes decentralization is an important process, but it's important to make sure that it doesn't lead to a significant increase in spending.
So would you like to say something more or give message to Nepali people, Nepali stakeholders?
No, absolutely. I would like to say that for Nepali people and stakeholders, we at the IMF, we are really here to help the government and to help the authorities. And our main objective is simple. It's really the betterment of the Nepal economy for the Nepali people. So we hear, we listen, we hear, we give advice, we do our best to really, really help the people, and we always happy to see success. And we see that Nepal is a country with high potential, and we really see the investment summit as a great opportunity to showcase to the world the potential of Nepal. And we hope that this will really provide a momentum for the government to accelerate the reform. That is very, very important. Nepal has great potential, but it's important to accelerate the pace of reform in order to be able to really benefit from the whole potential that Nepal has. But again, we're really here for the Nepali people, and we will do our best to continue supporting the country.
Thank you, Mr. Kenda.
Thank you.
Thank you.